So as we wrap up the communication section of Pyrrhus and Cineas, I just want to remind how this section starts. She says, "An initial analysis of my relationships with others has thus led me to this result. The other asks me for nothing, and he is not a void that I would have to fill. I can discover no ready-made justification of myself in him." So no ready-made justification is important. She goes on, "And yet each of my actions, by falling into the world, creates a new situation for him. I must assume these actions. I want certain situations, and I reject others. But why is it then that they do not appear to me as indifferent, that I can choose between them?" And then the next paragraph, "We must first turn away from the airs of false objectivity. The serious mind considers health, fortune, education, and comfort as indisputable goods, whose worth is written in heaven." So in the Ethics of Ambiguity, she's going to talk about what she calls serious men, or serious people. And here is an early example of what seriousness from the existentialist perspective entails, right? So when she says that false objectivity of the serious mind is that these goods that she listed are written in the reality of the world, that they're absolute goods independently of human ends and projects. And that's a false objectivity. No value exists or stands independently of human projects because it's our engagement and action in the world that generates value in the first place. So health and all of that aren't worth anything independently of the way that humans value and require health in their projects and so on and so forth. So again, that will come back up in the Ethics of Ambiguity. The serious man or the serious person is a type that she analyzes at length as an example of sort of bad faith. And this false objectivity of believing or holding these values to be transcendent beyond human affairs or engagements is an important part of that analysis that she does. And it's important for the remainder of Pyrrhus and Cineas as well. So where we left off was picking up on the thread that she just started there, how do I choose? And we had referred to Safra, the negativity, that this absence appears in the world, and that we establish necessity by our creation and our action in the world. There's no predetermined, again, there's no that false objectivity, there's no predetermined need in the world that we are trying to fill up, but our actions are creating and generating needs. So it's only through a particular situation that is enacted among people that someone could derive a need in the first place. The example was not enough food. And then in response to that human established situation, some other thing will be generated. And then that will have its own necessity. Now we can respond to the situation in different ways, and each different response is going to bring about different necessities for its maintenance and the way that it responds and so on and so forth. But all of that necessity is going to be relative to like the initial project and among humans, right? Now, the communication section gets really interesting immediately after that part on, I think it's on 128, right after that section on the negativities, the Safra reference that she makes. She says on page 129, "Human freedom must then carve out a place for this new plenitude that we cause to spring forth in the world. This place was not, and neither are we the ones who made it. We have only made the object that fills it up. Only the other can create a need for what we give him. Every appeal and every demand comes from this freedom. In order for the object I founded to appear as a good, the other must make it his own good, and then I would be justified in having created it. The other's freedom alone is capable of necessitating my being. My essential need, therefore, is to be faced with free men. My project loses all meaning, not if my death is announced, but if the end of the world is announced to me. The time of scorn is also that of despair." I think a funny example of this would be like Elon Musk trying to make the submarine for the rescuing the soccer team, because it was useless, right? The rescue team didn't need it, and Musk seemed to be under the impression that he could just generate something, and the need for it would be immediately felt, and people would use it, and they would be, you know. But the invention of the submarine was completely superfluous because the others didn't demand it. It didn't take up a role in their project, which had other solutions that were enacted and were successful. So that, I think, is a funny example you could use to illustrate what she's saying about that the demand comes from the freedom of the other. That the only way my action can be necessitated is through the way it lands in the situation of others and is received and related to by them. Because again, nothing can become necessary sort of in a vacuum, and I am contingent. I am just there's nothing necessary or essential about my being. It's my relation to others that brings about this necessity. Again, that kind of necessity after the fact. So it's not for others that each person transcends himself. One writes books and invents machines that were demanded nowhere. I mean, I write a bunch of stuff that nobody asked me to write, and probably some people after they read it are like, "Boy, I wish you wouldn't have." But so it's not. I'm not necessarily writing for them, but it's not for oneself either, because self exists only through the very project that throws it into the world. So I'm not writing it for myself, because myself only comes to existence through the writing of the things that I write and other projects that I am engaged in. I am not I'm not trying to be a college professor for myself, because myself is only actualized through the project that I throw myself into of trying to be a professor. The fact of transcendence precedes all ends and all justification, but as soon as we are thrown into the world, we immediately wish to escape from the contingent and gratuitousness of pure presence. We need others in order for our existence to become founded and necessary. So if it's just me, the world appears as this sort of like plenitude. Beings have this fullness. But it is through my relationships of other that my transcendence is maintained toward a future where the situation is constantly being negotiated among us, right? Certain opportunities being closed, others opened, relationships changing and becoming possible, my role being altered in the projects of other people, and the projects of other people impacting me and taking on different roles within my projects, and so on and so forth. That's where things get grounded and become founded and necessary. If it was just me acting alone in a void, everything would appear as this like sort of pure and full presence. I would transcend myself toward them, but everything would only ever have the meaning that I sort of determined it to have. And I would be sort of folded up into myself in a way. It's almost an analogous problem that we saw with the instant, where I'm not really opened to the world because there's no one else to open or disclose the world to me. This idea of disclosure is going to become increasingly important. So I'll say a little bit more about disclosure in a minute, but Beauvoir will talk more about that again in The Ethics of Ambiguity. So she says again, it is not a matter of making recognized in us the pure abstract form of the self, so some substantial me, self, ego that exists inside me. I intend to say my being in the world as such as it is realized in my actions, my work, my life. Only through these objects that I make exist in the world can I communicate with others. If I make nothing exist, there is neither communication nor justification. So then she talks about how people will sometimes try to take credit for things that actually they didn't found, that aren't theirs. Remember earlier in the essay she had said that the only thing that I can really own, or that's really mine out there in the world, are my actions. That's the only thing totally sort of generated by me. And so she talks about the foolishness of people who try to claim things that actually they didn't really even do. Their ancestors, their whatever tradition, their this and that and the other, their nationality or something like that, that they claim. So she says there's something foolish in a particular way of being proud about these things. When you're proud of them as if you did it, right? That's what's foolish. You can still have like pride in your ethnic heritage or your cultural, community or your ancestors, but the problem is when you act as though you did those things, or you're taking credit for what your ancestors did, and you're great because you're related to so and so, whatever. No, you didn't do that. You don't really get to take credit for it in a particular way. It's important, and you can still talk about it. It might be part of your situation, and so on and so forth. So it's not to say that it's not formative or it's not significant, but you don't sort of get to claim it like you did it. That's, I think, the key thing. So this is the whole thing of communication. I have to act first. That is what establishes my communication. I'm not going to just find myself in the eyes of the other unformed. If I seek myself in the eyes of others before I have fashioned myself, I am nothing. I take on a shape and existence only if I first throw myself into the world by loving, by doing, and my being enters into communication with others only through those objects in which it is engaged. I must resign myself to never being entirely saved. So again, we are sort of treading this middle ground between I need the other in order to provide me with a situation in which I can justify myself, but I can't look for myself and my own image in the eye of the other to just like give me my essence or something like that. I must act and do. That is what provides the other something that they can respond to in order to reflect me back to myself. This is how communication is happening, right? When I act in the world, I disclose the world in a certain way. Things appear and are disclosed with a certain meaning and significance relative to my actions. And that also gives a certain appearance to the other who bears witness to the actions and so on. So I have to have thrown myself and be acting in order to then come into communication with others. Because remember, once I act and it's established and it begins to sink into the past, it becomes objectified. It appears like an object among the world, right? This is the importance of sort of being named, right? She says, this is why we worry about being named. The name is my total presence magically assembled into the object, but in truth, our actions are separate and we exist for others only insofar as we are present in our actions. So we worry about having a label put on us, about being named, because that name comes to represent the totality of our being. It shrinks us down or converts us into in itself. But the name is not actually going to capture that. It fails because I'm on the side of my actions, right? The name doesn't actually capture all. That's why she says, but our actions are separate. We exist for others only insofar as we are present in our actions, and therefore in our separation, right? As a distinct agent or actor out there in the world, sort of that becomes present to the other. Because just, again, remember, going back to that theory of consciousness, if my actions appear to the other, by virtue of being an appearance, they're something separated, because the only way a thing can become present to someone as an appearance is through the distance, through the fundamental negation at the heart of consciousness by which the object is posited. So there has to be a separation, or it's not even possible for me or my actions to appear to the other without that separation, the initial negation, right? This is just following from the theory of consciousness that Beauvoir and Safra are sort of working out in these works, right? So these are the sort of ethical implications that are being derived from Beauvoir's understanding of human beings, our existence in the world, and the relationships that then we have. So we talk a little bit here about how this justification works. And at the bottom of 130, Beauvoir talks about this fraught relationship, demanding praise from critics who he claims to scorn, and asks for the admiration of a public that he judges to be imbecilic. Truly the other to possess this power of making the object I found necessary, I must not be able to transcend him in turn. As soon as the other appears to me as limited or finite, the place he creates for me on earth is contingent and useless, vain as himself. So we're not seeking approval from some object. We're seeking approval from sort of like a peer or someone whose transcendence we respect. She brings up this example of they. Many women give up their lovers on the advice of their concierges because the lover is only a man. The concierge is the voice of the public, and that mysterious they that exists and yet extends to infinity. A writer looks up with satisfaction when someone tells him they admire you, but as soon as he knows the name of his admirers, he is disappointed. This is a concept that comes from Heidegger. There are two important concepts at play in this essay from Heidegger. Here, very explicitly, is they. Heidegger has this concept of the they, das Man, and it's sometimes he talks about we have a they self, like a generic self. The they is the anonymous but always present public idea of the public that we personify. So in English we have these sayings like, well, you know what they say, well, that's what they say. Or when we talk about like a movie or something, it'll be like, people seem to like it, that kind of thing. Who's they? Who are the people? It's just the general idea that we've made and solidified of the general public and the sort of common and status quo morals and judgments that we perceive to be sort of out there, the kind of predominant attitude of the time. And we make that into basically, like, we personify it as the they, or das Man in Heidegger. And we oftentimes sort of surrender ourselves. That's the idea of the they selves. We often sort of surrender to this and allow ourselves to be taken up with the flow of popular opinion and so on and so forth. This is another thing we'll see in Beauvoir with the serious man, and what is translated. I don't love the translation, but we'll talk about that when we get there. The subhuman or the subman, who submits themselves in a way to this they self. The other important concept from Heidegger, just to take a minute here, that I think is operating in Beauvoir's essay, Pyrrhus and Cineas, is the difference between leaping in and leaping ahead. This goes back to the example of the child in the tree. When you leap in, you do it for the person. You put the kid up in the tree. Whereas when you leap ahead, you open the freedom of the other to an opportunity. So you do something helpful to allow the child to do it on their own. So you're helping them, and you're opening a path for them. You're opening an opportunity, but you're not just leaping in and jumping in and doing it for them, or doing it in their place, rather, circumventing their own actual freedom and ability to do the deed. So I think those two things from Heidegger are pretty influential in this essay generally, and you can see she's talking about they, this anonymous public, that the public, the mysterious they that exists and yet extends to infinity. So this is, I mean, it's not just a concept, it exists, it's a thing. I mean, we all have this sort of sense of like, what's out there in the public, what's the discourse, we talk about that on Twitter or whatever the case may be, the discourse, what people are talking about, the general temperature of, that philosophy Twitter's like all talking, people are talking about panpsychism, a few weeks ago, or whatever the case may be. So this is the kind of thing, just like the general atmosphere going on amongst people in the public and in public discourse, right? So that's, I think, the important element there. So again, you don't you need the freedom of others, right? This is just necessary, that you need others. I must have a freedom facing me. Freedom is the only reality that I cannot transcend. So the issue here with I am always transcending objects. I'm always overcoming them. I'm always going past objects in time. I can transcend them toward their use, fold them into a project. I can be done with them and set them aside. But a freedom sort of stands facing me in a way, and it presents me again with certain decisions and choices that I have to make. Beauvoir talks about the shock she felt as a 13-year-old when a friend whom she admired violently contradicted an opinion of my father's. She judged my father judged her in return, and I could therefore appeal to my father against my friend, to my friend against my father. This going back and forth, the absolute slipped away. I could no longer rely on anyone. So she's not dealing with one freedom, but with several, and precisely because they are free, they do not agree amongst themselves. Kantian ethics enjoins me to seek the support of all humanity, but we have seen that there exists no heaven where the reconciliation of human judgments is accomplished. We have to live here in the world with these different demands on us, and we have to decide whether or not we think the father or the friend has the better view or whatever. We can't just, nothing is going to come from the outside and just tell us and confirm it with absolute certainty. We have to judge for ourselves what the, way to go is. And Kant really requires the Christian worldview to be true for his ethics to work. I mean, that's how Beauvoir is reading him, that he needs, in order to support all humanity, we need there to be heaven where humans are reconciled. This is where Kant gets into stuff about the postulates of pure practical reason. There are certain things that we need to posit in order to satisfy ethical requirements sort of concretely, so that they'll meet his universal and absolute standard, that God will judge the guilty, that there will be sort of this reconciliation that happens, and so on and so forth, that justice will be carried out. So that's why we posit certain metaphysical concepts like a God, like the immortality of the soul and things like that. Beauvoir has pulled all that away. Right? There is no grand reconciliation coming. And so she says, here one finds the point of view of the universal that allows neither praise nor blame, since no void within it could even be supposed. Success appears only through a definite project that posits an end and carves out a retrospective appeal behind it. The dilettante, who claims to love everything, loves nothing. In order to be pleased about the existence of Rimbaud or Cézanne, one must prefer a certain poetry and a certain way of painting above others. An object is grasped as having needed to be what it has been only if a singular choice flows back from the future toward it. This very reality that we throw into the world would be saved only if others found a future that envelops it by surpassing it, and only if new objects choose it in the past for the future. It's other people who are determining how far my project will extend, how far my influence is, right? Kant is still read because philosophers find it interesting and necessary within their own projects to talk about Kant. And we don't talk about other philosophers because we didn't do that. There are projects of like rehabilitation, like to reclaim and rediscover the voices of women philosophers from the early modern period. Something like Project, I think it's called Project Vox at Duke, has been doing an online project, right? Well, because of the way that women were framed, the concept of womanhood that excluded them from serious philosophical pursuit, historical philosophers have rejected the necessity of those voices. Today we're demanding them, right? And so this project of reclamation comes because we have decided that it is necessary for our projects and for our understanding of the history of philosophy to reclaim the voices of women philosophers. and to offer to people who want to do philosophy today, who identify as women, that it's possible, and that they have predecessors, and they can transform that legacy into their own by adapting it as their project. The idea of representation is, I think, important on this front, that people can see that we can open an opportunity to other people by allowing them to see themselves in a project, that project could be theirs, that they're not a priori excluded, or excluded from it just because of the kind of person that they are, right? So I think a lot of those kinds of projects are important. And again, it also speaks to the way that Beauvoir is talking about necessity. We are determining now, after years of neglect, that representation, rediscovering the voices of marginalized peoples in the history of philosophy, is necessary. And we don't all agree about it. Some people say it's not necessary for me, and I don't want to have to worry about whoever, Cavendish or any of these people. I don't care. So there's now a kind of a struggle going on within academia broadly, and philosophy in particular, about the role that these things play. So I think the existentialists actually give us a very good theoretical framework to think through some of these problems. In culture, I mean, Beauvoir broadly is a cultural critic as well. There are certain sections of the second sex that are devoted to the analysis of fairy tales and stories that we tell children, and social, political facts that we see in literature, reflected in literature and in like psychoanalysis and that kind of thing, right? So existentialism has a very robust, these aren't just abstract considerations for the existentialists. These are applicable, living, everyday things. They talk about them sometimes in an abstract way, but I think you can see she begins to trot out really sort of powerful examples of the way that people are made into objects. The most convenient solution would be to challenge the judgments that bother me by considering the men who pass them as simple objects, denying them their freedom. They are barbarians, slaves, thought the decadent Romans, in seeing themselves cursed by the men working and suffering for them. He is a Negro, thought the planter of Virginia, and by rigid taboos these parasitic societies try their best to defend the masters against the consciousness of the creatures whom they are exploiting. They must not be recognized as men. So the enslaved black person from Africa, or wherever they're from, is seen as an object in the eyes of the planter, and the planter denies the freedom of the slave. And Beauvoir says that outright it's parasitic. The parasitic relationship in which the master uses the freedom of the oppressed in order to achieve their own ends. And one of the ways they justify themselves is to deny outright the freedom, that they're a lesser order of being. And so they don't have this dimension of freedom that I have to respect and worry about. I don't have to worry about how they're open to the future and all of that kind of stuff. Then the parasite ignores the human character of the objects that he uses. Because remember, we do appear in the world as objects, as bodies. So there is a sense in which we can be put to use through our labor power and that kind of thing, like an object or like a tool. But to do that just ignores the dimension. This is the exploitation of labor in the contemporary world. You sell your labor to your employer, and your employer views you as a human resource. And if you're working in the service industry or someplace like that, your employer doesn't really care what you have going on in your life, or so on and so forth. You're expected to show up and work your shift and leave your problems at the door and not disrupt the workplace with your personal projects and investments and all that. It's irrelevant to your job as the resource that needs to fulfill certain tasks for the employer and not for yourself. So all kinds of exploitative relationships, and again, Beauvoir says that they're parasitic. That the freedom or the project of the master is parasitic upon the freedom of the one who's oppressed or used for the completion of the master's project, right? So here again you can see the strong ethical and political dimension that Beauvoir is really focusing on and bringing more into the fore, right? She says very clearly that the parasite becomes human again only in turning towards his peers, and then he finds himself in danger before their freedoms. So when the planters in Virginia are all together, having their balls or whatever it is that they're having, they find that human freedom facing them again, but then these are their competitors. This is where they engage in all of the sort of like politics of the planter class, the master class, and all of that kind of stuff, because they recognize that they are a role, they're a competitor, they're something in the eyes of the other. We're not free, she says, to treat other men as things as we like. The master knows he must speak to the slave. One only speaks to men. Language is an appeal to the other's freedom, since the sign is only a sign through a consciousness that grasps it again. He feels the look of the slave. As soon as he is looked at, he is the one who is object. So again, there's an element of bad faith at play here, because as soon as you address and appeal to the slave, as soon as you say to the worker, go bust that table, you have spoken to them and addressed their freedom. And so, again, like bad faith, this parasitic relationship is sort of like metastable. It can collapse at any time. It can always fall away. The mask can fall away, and this situation of the other's freedom can be revealed to you. You can't speak, or you don't speak to objects. So you can trick yourself into denying the humanity of others for a time, but as soon as you're called upon, or the situation demands that you speak to them, the illusion is shattered, and you've admitted then, because you've addressed their freedom to do or not to do. So I'm going to leave this video there, and we'll pick up and push on toward the end of this. So we have one more section on action, and then the concluding remarks coming up. So I will pick up here. I think this is a very powerful part of the essay that's really worth spending some time on. So we'll start there in the next video. Thanks.